Hello, this is the webinar about combined transport. The webinar is a part of the Combine project, which is co-financed by the European Regional Development Fund in the framework of the Interreg Baltic Sea Region 2014 to 2020.
Hi everyone, dear friends and supporters of intermodal transport and combined transport. I'm Iven Kramer, the head of unit for port economy and shipping at Bremen's Ministry of Science and Ports. We are in this position directly responsible for the port railway system within our ports. And I will use the chance today to explain you a little bit about our experiences in intermodal transport. For this, I have prepared a little presentation which I will use for this webinar. And the overall topic is going to be Mission Zero, zero emission transport systems, and the role of combined terminals and the cargo shift from road to rail and to waterway. And I will finally focus a bit more on the road transportation on the European hinterland, as the ports of Germany in general, they are very, very strong in this respect. Okay. When I have been asked for giving the presentation, I started, let's say, with a little agenda for this webinar. I will tell you a few introducing words about our ports, about myself, about our role in intermodal transport. And of course, then I will clearly come to the mission that we are all in. It's a mission for intermodal transport. It's a mission from the political side, on the European level, on the national level, of course, also on the regional level, on the level of the ports, the terminals. Everyone which is involved in the sector is on the mission to, first of all, reducing emissions, and finally, let's say, bringing down the emissions to zero. There is a clear role of ports and terminals, and I will explain a little bit, let's say, those roles and our responsibilities in this respect. And as already said, we will have a clear focus on inland waterway transport and on rail hinterland transport. Before I just jump into the presentation here, there were like 3 questions that have been asked to me by the organizers of the whole let's say, the whole project, and I was asked also to answer these questions. The questions are: which ones are terminal operators' options towards greenhouse gas emission reductions? Number 2, what is the terminal owner or authority's perspective on the European Union policy to support the cargo shift, or the shift of cargo towards, let's say, rail and inland waterway? And thirdly, finally, what are the main barriers for maritime rail transshipment that are out of the scope of terminal operators but still are appearing within terminals? And at least I can tell you that all of these questions are, let's say, they would be very valued to have our own webinar on these questions. But I will try, let's say, to focus within these next few minutes on not just answering these questions, but also to, let's say, focus a little bit more on the overall scene of combined transport. Combined transport, as already mentioned, is on a mission. And the mission is set very, very clearly. So we have international shipping lines who have dedicated themselves towards the goal of, let's say, operating their fleet with zero emissions in the year 2050. The IMO, which is the International Maritime Organization, is a little bit lacking behind. Let's say their ambitions are not that high, but we see really the big shipping lines, let's say, having very, very ambitious goals for the reductions of the emissions on the seaside. That's the good news, first of all. If we then jump over to the ports, if we then jump over to the hinterland transport of containers, but all the other commodities as well, then we already have a pretty good situation. As long as we are operating, let's say, our cargo transport or intermodal transport on the railways, you see it here in the picture on the right-hand side, we do already have, let's say, electrical transport. We have electrified transport systems since roughly the 1960s. Most of the, or what means most, but many, let's say, trunk lines on the European continent are electrified. We do have typical block trains these days running from the ports to the hinterland terminals, and they are running in daily or, let's say, weekly services between the big seaports and all the hinterland depots that we have on our continent, which is very, very good. And that kind of transport already is, let's say, emission-free, depending a little bit, of course, where the energy is coming from, which we use for electrical driving on the trains. But we do have, let's say, some little pieces which are left, which are the so-called shunting areas, and the last miles in rail transport. The same happens, let's say, on the waterways. We will focus a little bit closer around that one. But also there you will find lots of, let's say, shipping lines, lots of logistics service providers who have dedicated themselves towards zero emission, the goal of zero emission. Interestingly enough, when the discussion started, I would personally say about 10, 15 years ago, then we had, let's say, we had some ambitions also from the ports of Bremen. I can clearly tell you that the ports of Bremen, we have set up a green port strategy. Now it was like 12 years ago in the year 2021. And when we started with our green ports strategy, there were very few who did the same. There were some early beginnings on the level of the European Seaports Organization. There was a so-called port environmental refuse system just under development. A few ports really dedicated themselves towards, let's say, making the ports greener. And making the ports greener always means, let's say, putting a strong focus on hinterland transport and, of course, on encouraging rail transport, on encouraging, let's say, inland waterway transport. Also on the trucking side, there's lots of movement to be seen right now. Also there we see lots of activities related to, let's say, first of all, the savings of fuel, but also, of course, for new kinds of fuel, may it be LNG, may it be gas, may it be also, let's say, hydrogen power, which we see already in some trucks. But that's just a short, let's say, just a very few beginnings. But to make it short and to let's say to conclude this, let's say the mission here, we see it everywhere. All the transport sectors, may it be road, may it be rail, may it be inland waterway, all the lines, the companies which are involved in that kind of business, they have all dedicated themselves. They have all put themselves onto the mission, and that's what we do. So the goal is clearly set. We want to reduce the emissions, and how can we do this? What is our role? What can terminals do in this respect? And that's, of course, let's say the most important question. I would personally say it's always who is exactly responsible and who can do something about it. So we have, first of all, we have, let's say, political papers from the level of starting with the Green Deal of the European Union, which is perfect. So we have, let's say, our goal clearly set, but that doesn't define exactly who is responsible for what kind of, let's say, part of the intermodal transport chain, of the international maritime transport chain, as we always like to say it. If we see here one of these, let's say, big ships that is frequently calling, or those kind of ships are frequently calling in the ports of Bremen. By the way, the ports of Bremen are the number 2 seaport in Germany, the number 7 in containers on the European continent. And we are very, very strong in the handling of automobiles. So just giving you an idea, let's say, what we are talking about and what our experience in this respect would be. So it is very clear, not just the ports of Bremen, but all the ports along the European coastline. A bit more than 350 of those are listed, let's say, on the level of the European Seaports Organization. They are all essential infrastructures, first of all. They are enablers and facilitators of international maritime transport. So the commodities are coming in, the commodities are being loaded and unloaded from the ships towards the ships. And that's the good thing. And let's say by tradition, the terminal operators, also the ports themselves, they put a lot of focus on within their investments onto, let's say, proper conditions for the loading and unloading of ships, which means we have invested billions of euro into new quay walls. We have invested, or the terminal operators have invested, as you can see probably in the picture, in these huge ship-to-shore cranes. Only 10 years after they have implemented those ones, new cranes have to be implemented because we see the growth in ship sizes still going on. We now have typically 24,000 TEU vessels calling at our ports, loading and unloading, up to 10,000 TEU at just one single call, which gives us peak times. And of course, we need to have the right equipment for that. So we have to have, first of all, the right infrastructure. access channels, let's say the width and the depth of the access channels is important to the ports. But then the ships are coming in, and then the real intermodal story begins. What we can clearly say from our port's experience is, and at least that's the same all along the northwestern European, let's say, coastline, that more and more we see shipping lines, railway operators, barge operators are being vertically integrated. So they are not just sharing information, they are not just sharing data about arrival times, but they are also working, let's say, on the operational side together. And that's one of the one of the key figures for future development. If we want to improve the intermodal connectivity, then of course cooperation. That's just one of the most important things. And cooperation, not just between different shipping lines, what we see with the big alliances, for example, on the global oceans, with only 3 big alliances being left for the time being, but also for cooperation between the shipping lines and the intermodal service providers. That's very, very important what we see. Okay, coming from the essential infrastructures, I think that's very, very clear. Without the ports, there will be no intermodal connectivity. And we have all the, let's say, all the modes of transport which are coming together within our ports. And that's, let's say, a key prerequisite of intermodal transport. And as we have it that way, of course, the ports have, let's say, established themselves as being forerunners in this respect for emission reduction. For example, again, I said it, the ports of Bremen, they have, let's say, clearly defined a so-called green ports strategy, which is in line, of course, with the overall development strategy of our ports. We have been the #1 in Germany who did that, and we have seen lots and lots of followers, and of course, all over the world nowadays, let's say, the keyword of green ports or smart port energy, that's very, very widespread. We have green ports conferences and so on. And what we clearly see is that when the ports, let's say, did some first initial steps, they tried to reduce the emissions from the port operational side. That means bringing equipment into service which is not, let's say, burning fossil fuels or using less fossil fuels. That's one thing that can be done and that will be done. Also, all the constructions that are taking place within the ports, all the maintenance works that are taking place within the ports, they can be reduced. What means reduced? But the emissions which are connected to those works can be reduced. That's what we already do since a couple of years. And our port management company in the ports of Bremen, which is called Bremen Ports, that company itself has already established that goal or achieved that goal to operate emission-free. That's perfect. But of course, if we want to, let's say, bring down the emissions all along the intermodal supply chain, then of course it's not just the focus on the infrastructure providers, it's also the focus on the operators themselves and also on the superstructure providers. What we clearly can say is that all these ship-to-shore cranes, let's say, they are working, of course, on electricity nowadays. And there's also one more important thing, which we would, let's say, to make it short, which we would call the electrification of ports. We see more and more all over the world. We see more and more electrical, let's say, equipments, which means we see straddle carriers, we see reach stackers, we see any kind of stackers, we see forklifts, whatever you can imagine, which is needed, let's say tug masters within the port. All that kind of equipment is, let's say, subject to change, not just by the operational figures, but also by the question, let's say, what kind of fuel they are using and what kind of technology is in use. We are not that far as we sometimes think. That's also something that I would like to mention here. So there's still a long way to go because so far we only have some test activities related to LNG, for example, as being a bridge technology. We also have some test technologies with hybrid carriers. We have some, let's say, technologies with battery-driven, let's say, kind of equipment within the ports. So it's always easy if you are thinking about bringing new equipment into the operational side. That's not a big problem. And then we clearly can say that all along the European ports, we have, let's say, new equipment coming in, which is emission free or let's say really reduced by their emissions. So the ports are the forerunners, but still, as long as we have that much equipment already in operation, that's also then, let's say, the big question: how can we, let's say, change all the already existing equipment? And there are some, let's say, areas where we have equipment which is not just 5 years old or not just 3 years old, but which is older. And then, of course, we need to have a clear strategy to also focus on the renewing and, of course, on the reduction of, let's say, emissions from those kind of equipments. The terminals are really best practice providers. We can see it from the German perspective. There is in Hamburg, for example, home-based the HHLA, Hamburg Hafen and Logistics AG, home-based in Bremen, Eurogate, operating lots of terminals all along the European coastline. And they have their own clear projects, their own clear ambitions to bringing the reductions down finally to zero. And that means we will see lots and lots and lots of good best practices for this kind of activities. And to sum it up, there is a clear role of ports and terminals. And what we also do from the ports perspective is we are, let's say, sort of networkers, we are moderators, we are organizing conferences. Sometimes also we are taking part in webinars like this one, which is still a bit new for me in person, I can say. But anyhow, that's at least what we do, let's say, to support and to promote the overall development. And one final thing here, that would be, from my personal point of view, very, very important. When we started from the ports of Bremen to making our ports greener with the green port strategy, there were almost no customers, which were really, let's say, in favor. Everyone said, yes, okay, you can do this. That's a good idea. So we get some support. But what we also have clearly noticed is that almost no real port customer, was willing, let's say, to give some additional euro or some additional cents for a green port operational side or a green terminal operations. And that has changed already. So we see more and more customers, more and more also OEMs, which are really, let's say, taking it serious and which are thankful if we are not just improving only the intermodal connectivity, but also when we are, let's say, working hard for bringing the emissions down and finally to zero. So that's the very good thing. So coming from the role of ports and terminals, we can definitely say there is a clear role that we have, but also we do have a clear role in intermodal transport. That means we are also taking care for the improvement of inland waterway connectivities. We are taking care for the improvement of railway connectivities or railway connections. It is always a little bit tricky because that's not just the case only in Germany, but all over the European continent. We do have shared responsibilities. And that's why I'm always personally saying, if we want to improve intermodal connectivity, if we want to improve, if we want to support our joint mission on bringing down the emissions, then we need to have a good teamwork, which simply means we need to have, let's say, the port authority, the terminal operators. We also need the service providers, the trucking companies, the railway undertakings, and so on. They all have to work together, and also that has to be in line with European, national, and of course regional policies. That's most important thing. So improving, let's say, the intermodal connectivity, that's very, very simple. That's teamwork. And it doesn't work if only one person or one unit or one, let's say, partner in the intermodal chain is working on it and the other ones don't. That doesn't work. So we are in a procedure of teamwork. If we are now briefly looking a bit closer to inland waterway transport, what will we find? Inland waterway transport is, of course, on the big rivers on the European continent. May it be the River Rhine, may it be the Danube, may it be also in Germany the River Elbe. That plays a clear role, of course, but it's also facing a lot of challenges. And to start with, I would personally say just look to the picture on the right-hand side, and it's a discussion which is nothing new. The discussion has been there, let's say, since we saw the growth of the big container ships, and let's say with the growth in size of the big container ships, we have also seen increasing problems with the loading and unloading of the smaller barges. At least you see here in the front picture one of the barges typically operating on the River Weser. So they have frequent services, daily services between the port of Bremerhaven. As I said, the number 7 on the European continent if it comes to container handling. And then, of course, the more inland-based ports like Bremen, like Brake, like Minden, or Brunswick or Hanover. So there's good connections from our ports to the hinterland. Within the hinterland terminals, of course, we have dedicated cranes, we have dedicated equipment for the loading and unloading of these smaller barges. Within the big seaport terminals, we do have these very, very big ship-to-shore cranes, which are more than 110 meters high nowadays, which have an outreach, of course, which have to have an outreach to load and unload containers. Also in the 26th row on, let's say, if it comes to the width of the big container ships. So that's what we can do, and that's let's say the clear way forward. But of course, if we are then working with these kind of equipment on these very small barges, that's of course a challenge. First of all, for the crane drivers, of course, but of course also for the overall logistics chain. So the prices are comparatively high. And what we have already, there are some ports which have dedicated barge terminals, which is good, but still then you need to transport the containers from the, let's say, from the sea terminal towards the barge terminal. So there's always sort of a broken transport, and additional loading and unloading is needed. That's one of the challenges. There are a few more. If you are coming, let's say, or if you are looking a bit closer to the European hinterland, then we will find bridges. We will find, let's say, sometimes if there is a dry season, then we will find low water in the rivers. Then, of course, after a certain period of time, after a couple of months, we will see high water. So there's lots of, let's say, challenges connected to inland barges. But very, very important, first of all, is that the waterways in Europe, they have a huge potential left. And the good news is what we clearly see is that the shipping operators that we have on the River Weser, but also on other rivers, they are now clearly focusing on, first of all, also reducing the emissions. There's one good option. What we have seen and where we do have good experiences already, if they are using GTL instead of diesel, gas to liquid, that's very good thing, because you are bringing down the emissions just, let's say, from one day to the other. If it comes to particulate matters, if it comes to nitrogen, if it comes to sulfur oxides. So that's a very, very good option. It's a little bit more expensive, but it is a good option, let's say, as a sort of a bridge technology. We also see some LNG vessels in the inland waterway transport. We also see some, let's say, test beds already with hydrogen in use, ammonia. So lots of these kinds of discussions, but then those ones alone, let's say, what kind of new fuels will be used in future, that would be another topic for a whole new set of not just one, but many, many different webinars. Anyhow, to come to the conclusion here, what will we see on inland waterway transport? We will also see some, let's say, new and also partly autonomous vessels, or at least, let's say, more automatically driven vessels. And that's another challenge we have, let's say, the people on board, which is more and more complicated to find those people. So there's also, not just by that reason, but also by logistical reasons, there is a clear path forward for autonomous vessels. We have lots and lots of test beds already on different European rivers or canals, where, let's say, autonomous systems, not whole ships, but systems, are being tested right now. And we will definitely see autonomous ships very, very soon in our future on the European rivers and on the European canals. So that's something where we can definitely, let's say, leverage the potential that inland waterway already has for us. And then, of course, that goes in line with the reduction of the emissions. So, and to make it simple, to bring more commodities onto the waterways, onto the inland waterways, that alone is a very good step, let's say, for the reduction of emissions. It's going to be the same if we are looking to rail hinterland transport. I already mentioned in the beginning that we have, since the 1960s, electrified railways, and from the ports, let's say the ports of Bremen, they have decided to be a railway port almost 100 or a bit more than 160 years ago. So a very, very long time ago. Let's say people have decided that shipping and railways, that they belong together. And that's totally true. That's part of the intermodal supply chain. That's part of the intermodal solution. And since the 1960s, as I said, we do have electrical, let's say, transport on the railways. What we have in the ports are daily connections from the North Sea ports, but also from the Baltic Sea ports towards, let's say, the European hinterland or the landlocked states like Austria, Switzerland, Czech Republic, Slovakia. And that's really a success story, I would personally say. If you're looking to the overall European ambition, the overall European ambition is looking for a rail share of 25% for the overall transport in Europe. This is nothing compared to, let's say, the share that we have already achieved within the seaports. Like in our port of Bremerhaven, for example, we already have a rail share, a modal share of railways, if it comes to container hinterland transport, of almost 50%. That's one of the highest shares on the European continent. We have Gothenburg, we have the port of Koper in Slovakia, which is, let's say, which is having even a little bit higher figure, but that's very, very good. And if it then comes to the question, how many containers do we bring on the railways? We have more than 1 million coming via the railways to the ports or leaving the ports via railways. In Hamburg, even more. The port of Hamburg, it's the largest rail port all over Europe. And we have more than 2.5 million TEU being transported by rail or via rail to the port and into the hinterland. So there's a very, very strong connection. And most ports, to my knowledge, most ports are working on this to improve their own facilities, their own connectivity. And it's also coming back to the question, who has which role to do, who has, let's say, what can be done to improve these facilities even stronger. There's one thing, of course, always infrastructure. We need to have the right capacities. We need to have proper infrastructure. We need to have an infrastructure which is well maintained and which is, let's say, usable 24/7, 365 days a year. The infrastructure of the railways should not break down if there's some snow falling. It should also not break down if the temperature in the summertime is going, let's say, higher than 30 degrees. So the switches still have to be working and so on. Lots of, let's say, 1,000 little things, I would always call it, that can go wrong, and unfortunately that do go wrong, not just in the ports, but overall on the railway system. But that's, to my personal, let's say, to my personal experience, one of the most important success stories. If we want to improve intermodal transport, if we want to bring down the emissions, then we have to focus on these, let's say, modes of transport. Railways, as already mentioned, for us, for our ports, they make a share of more than 50% right now. And our clear ambition is to bring this up even higher to a share of, may it be 70% in the end. So that's something which simply requires additional infrastructure, additional capacities, and it also requires, let's say, better procedures, better processes. And especially if it comes to rail transport, then we see something which is, I would personally say it's strange, because if a train arrives in the port area, and no matter where that is, that might be in Gdansk, that might be in Rostock, that might be in Hamburg, or in Rotterdam, or in our ports, typically we see the electrical locomotive then, let's say, driving away, and then all the wagons will be waiting. The wagons have to be checked, and then after a certain period of time, there will be a shunting locomotive taking on these wagons and transporting them into the terminals where loading and unloading procedures can take place. If that works well, then it is only, let's say, 1, 2, maybe 3 hours. If it works not that well, if, let's say, these different service providers are not connected in the best possible way, then it might be even more. And that's the big difference between railways and let's say the other modes of transport. We are losing a lot of time at the last mile. That's my personal experience over the last few years. And we therefore have been working on autonomous systems, on autonomous shunting systems. We have not, let's say, found the final solution, but that's something where we should put a clear focus on for the future, for the next few years. Because if we are able all together on the European continent, and not just in the seaports, but also in the hinterland terminals, if we can then bring down the let's say the times for the loading and unloading of trains, and also for the, let's say, service activities, which is the brake test, which is the seal check, which is the container check, if we can bring down this to almost zero by autonomous systems, then we will really make a big jump for the improvement of railways. We will have better capacities to use the existing infrastructure, to use the existing rolling stock. And that's something we should all be working on. My personal recommendation, I can clearly say, we are doing this already within the ports of Bremen and Bremerhaven. So the pathway is clearly set here. Zero emissions for in railways for hinterland transport, and also that also requires, let's say, to bring down the emissions on the last mile. And we have some test activities now with hybrid locomotives, for example, which are running on electrical energy on the main lines, and then which are using battery power within the ports for the shunting. And the same, as I already mentioned, with hydrogen, there are some companies who are, let's say, producing hydrogen shunting locomotives, and let's say trying to implement those into the day-to-day operations, also within seaports, but also within hinterland terminals. And finally, to come to the conclusion for this little webinar here, I would, let's say, just jump back to these initial questions that have been asked to me by one of the organizers of this project. So, which one are the terminal operators' options towards greenhouse gas emission reductions? And I said it, first of all, there are many, hundreds of those. But most importantly, I personally would say is, let's say, to improve processes and procedures within the terminals, and then, of course, to use equipment which is running on electricity, which is maybe running on hydrogen. And then, of course, we can really bring down the emissions within port operations. Just to give you an idea, let's say one of these typical straddle carriers that we still see, or what means still, that we see, then I would personally say 90% of the European ports, if we would just, let's say, reduce their emissions, they are using, I'm not quite sure, but I would say 100,000 liters of diesel per year, or even more. So they are also, from the operational costs side within the terminals, they are really big cost drivers. And if we could then, of course, let's say if the terminal operators could bring down these, not just the costs, but also the emissions, that would be, from the terminal operators' point of view, I personally would say, let's say, the best way to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. So electrification and new kinds of technology. And of course, which is always necessary, to improve procedures to cooperate all along the transport chain. Question number 2, what's the terminal owners and authorities' perspective on the European Union policy supporting cargo shifting? I think that can be done could be said very simple, very easy. We are, to my personal feeling, we are absolutely in line with the ambitions of the European Union. So the Green Deal has been welcomed by most of the ports, to my knowledge, by all of the ports in Europe. The European Green Deal has been, let's say, welcomed and supported by the railway undertakings, by the shipping lines. Of course, there is a sort of criticism if we are maybe too fast, if ambitions are too high. But the general objective, the general idea, that's very good. And also there's something which we like from our personal experience, like most of the ports, or many of the big ports, are part of the, let's say, European transport network, part of the transport TEN network in Europe. And that simply means if you are improving your capacities, if you are investing into your infrastructures, then you will also have the chance to get some co-funding from the European Union. And that, of course, that really supports, let's say, the ambitions of the terminals, that supports the ambitions of the ports, and of course also within hinterland operations. So that's a clear support from the policies of the European Union. That's what I can clearly say, of course, also from the perspective of the ports of Bremen. And what are the main barriers for maritime rail transshipment that are out of the scope of terminal operators, but still are appearing within terminals? And that's a question, again, which will have thousands of different answers. What we notice in our ports, but I think that's the same everywhere. If there is, let's say, a crane not operating in a terminal, may it be somewhere in the south of Germany, may it be somewhere in the south of Poland. So if there's one breakdown of a crane, then of course we will experience a delay, not necessarily, but it's very, very likely we will see a delay of, let's say, the whole train coming to our terminal, coming to our seaport. And if there's one delay, first of all, then it will be very hard to, let's say, to get away with that delay. What we also see is that, especially if it comes to June 2021, most of the shipping lines, they are not following their schedule. They have wonderful schedules, but they are all a bit lagging behind or a bit in front of their schedule. So let's say the direct combination between, let's say, the call of ships within the ports and the expected, let's say, arrival and departure of trains, the same with barges, the same with trucks, that's not in line. It's not balanced out right now. And that's why we have these big troubles all along the European coastlines, and that ends up with capacity problems, that ends up, of course, with complaints from customers, and of course with some shortages of some goods anywhere in the hinterland. So that's what we clearly say or can say is that we always have to put the focus not just onto one terminal or onto one shipping line or into one port, but we will also have to focus always, let's say, we have to clearly look to the overall intermodal supply chain, which means the port, the shipping line, first of all, the port, and then, let's say, the hinterland connectivity, and finally also the inland terminals. What we see from the ports, let's say from the big seaports, we are sometimes a little bit, we're feeling sorry that, let's say, we are working 24/7, but there are many hinterland depots, many hinterland terminals which are not working 24/7. And that, of course, if you are then missing out just by 1 hour, for example, the operational dates within an hinterland terminal, then, of course, the whole block train will not be operated sufficiently. So that are little things. Then we have, of course, electrical breakdowns. We will have some trains which are coming in where the brakes are not working properly. We will have some containers where we have, let's say, the seals not organized in a way that the customs are happy with those. And there are so many little things, even up to refugees. A couple of years ago, it was a business to try to, let's say, come to the ports as a refugee sitting between the containers on a train. So there are lots and lots of different things which can happen and which do happen. And overall, we have a very, very reliable system already on the railways. And what we also can see is, I personally really feel it, that competition on the railways between various, let's say, between those various railway undertakings. That's something which is very, very good and which really has, let's say, given the big push for us for having, let's say, a modal share of more than 50% already now on the railways. Yeah, and with these, let's say, little remarks, I know there would be many, many more things to talk about and to discuss and to explain. And I would personally also like to discuss and explain those things together with you. And therefore, I will finally conclude my presentation here with my personal data. So if there is anything else we should discuss, anything where we should share some ideas about the promotion of intermodal transport, then I would like to get in contact with you. And I'm now saying thank you very much. It was a pleasure to have you here in this webinar. Thank you.